This week on the Men at the Movies podcast, we talk about the 2004 film Crash. This redemptively disturbing movie is a mirror that reflects our faulty vision. Each character is at times a victim, and at other times a perpetrator. Our choices determine which way we will go and which identity we will embrace. Thankfully, the person I am today is not the end of the story. Join us as we discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and in just a minute, I'm going to be joined by Morgan Snyder. Before I bring in Morgan, I wanted to talk about this quote that I received the day after Morgan and I talked about Crash. The quote's from Burmese politician and Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. And she says, "It is not power that corrupts, but fear. Fear of losing power corrupts those who wield it, and fear of the scourge of power corrupts those who are subject to it." I wish that I would have gotten this quote the day before we recorded, because that quote really sums up what we see in this movie. We see characters who are both victims and perpetrators. We see characters who are both heroes and criminals. And this idea of power versus powerlessness comes through in our conversation. In Morgan's book, Becoming a King, he quoted Dallas Willard when he said the primary work of God is finding men to whom he can entrust his power. The story of most men is being entrusted with power and it bringing harm to themselves and those under their care. So if we take these truths about fear and power and about the story of most men who have power using it to bring harm to themselves and those under their care, see how that comes to light in the movie that we're discussing. See how that comes to light in your own life. And then the bigger question is, if that's our history, if that's our story to this point, and we see that power being used either against us or we're using power against others, how can we change the narrative? How can we become the men that God intended? How can, as Morgan frequently says, how can I become the man God meant when he meant me? So join Morgan and I as we enter into this challenging conversation. And joining me from way out in Colorado Springs is my friend Morgan Snyder. Hey, Morgan, how you doing today?
Paul, hey, buddy. It's great to be back with you. This is awesome.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We've been trying to coordinate since we did Company Men earlier this year. That was a movie that you love, and now we're gonna dive into another movie that you've loved, Crash. Back in 2005, 2004, it came out. So, Morgs, we do this every time. I basically give you a blank slate. The buffet is open for you. I say, hey man, pick what movie you'd want to do. So out of all the movies that you could have picked, why Crash? Why did you pick this movie?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, Dallas Willard once said of Jesus that the way his teaching worked is that when he said things, they were planted in us, but they were meant to be turned over within us again and again and again, and they would work their way inside of us. And Paul, I saw this film when it came out in 2004.
Yeah.
And it's probably the top 5 films that have stayed with me ever since. I mean, we're talking almost 2 decades.
Right.
The scene just burned impressions in my mind, and it just kept working in me. I think in some ways I was praying and reflecting on how do I describe my experience of this film? And I'm hoping all of our listeners have seen the film before the podcast. Yeah. So if you haven't seen it, my invitation is hit pause Go back, watch the film, and then come back. I've seen it so many times, and every time it does something fresh. So there's no spoiler alert in that. But I would name this film, Paul, as redemptively disturbing. It's the story of lives crashing into each other. The setting is LA in California. It's in an inner city kind of atmosphere. And there's literally crashes with people's car crashes, but it's far more than that. It's lives crashing into each other. And what's fascinating is it really plays on all of our stereotypes. The film is designed in a way that draws attention, right, to these very deep cultural stereotypes we have. And then it throws this 180 and it disrupts us because it blows you away because people don't fall in line with the stereotypes. And I think what I appreciate about it is it gets to the heart of the human experience, that at the end of the day, that which we share in common is greater than that which divides us. That which unites us is greater than that which divides us as humans, as imago Dei, as image bearers. But culturally, the profound energy in the world is division. It's distinction. It's to set us apart. And ultimately, we misunderstand. And so I think what I love about this film is ultimately it convicted me to look at myself, to be curious about how I see the world, about how I see other people, about what my bias is, about what the plank is, proverbially, as a metaphor or as a parable Jesus used, the plank of my eye, the plank in my eye that causes me not to see clearly the speck in your eye, which we can get into later. But this movie, unlike any other, has helped bring it to surface, and it's fascinating, it's powerful, and it can bring a source of real honest introspection and understanding of God and his kingdom.
And I love the phrase that you used, the redemptively disturbing, because it's not a comfortable movie to watch.
Say more. What did you think?
Because as you're watching it and you're seeing these people engaging in the different stereotypes, I think in a lot of movies, you have the caricatures, good guy, bad guy. And in these, as you mentioned, you've got your perception shifts as you understand their story more.
Yes.
And for me, I was watching in Matt Dillon's character, Officer Ryan. He's struggling with his dad. And he's struggling with the insurance company.
Right. So his dad's ill, elderly, and he's ill. Nobody knows that. He's a cop, but nobody knows his inner struggle of caring for his really sick dad that would get help if the insurance company would support them.
Right. And so he's frustrated, and his dad has a history of going out of business because of these legislations that sort of minimized or really promoted the minority-owned business, and he's a white guy. And so he's going up, and this isn't, we're not having a conversation about race, but that's a lot of what they deal with in the movie. But as they're going in, it's that effort of, he's this guy, he's struggling in this area, he's a jerk in this area, and he in one scene, one really powerful and one of the more disturbing scenes, he really molests the wife of one of the main characters as he's a cop, and he's pulled them over, and what I saw was he's feeling powerless in this one area where he wants to help his dad so badly, and he can't do it. And no matter what he does, there's no, you see as you've talked about the styles of relating, and he's trying to Sherman tank his way to get his dad the help, and it's not working. And so he takes his frustration and helplessness out on this other couple because he can. And then when that scene later in the movie where he goes in and actually saves her life, and that scene where she's screaming at him, she would almost rather be left in the car and die than have him help her.
Yes, and all the layers and the nuances to that, Paul. Like as you said, this isn't a conversation on race, but the film brings up a lot of race-based biases. And like that story, the woman that he molested was an affluent Black woman. And the story with his dad's company was he was a white man that employed all Black people, treating everyone equal, giving them dignity in their work for many years. And then his company went bankrupt overnight because of legislation that gave minorities opportunities over white people. And so he grew up in this turmoil of watching his dad suffer under the hands of legislation that to him gave an unfair advantage to Black people. And as you said, now he's a powerless man in a powerful position, and he reacts as a perpetrator because he's been a victim. And so it's a brilliant play of this idea of everyone in the film at some point is a victim.
Yeah.
And everyone in the film at some point is also a perpetrator. And what's really beautiful about the human experience is it daylights that reality of how can we be one person with part of us being so given over to good and wanting to bless and love and live courageously and sacrificially, and at the same time having a capacity from within the same self, seemingly, that can have such a bend towards evil, destruction, harm, or self-interest. And what's so beautiful about this film is it crossed all races. It crosses socioeconomic boundaries. It crosses vocational boundaries and educational boundaries to show that what we all have in common is this tug of war between victim and perpetrator. And we all have at core these struggles of identity in this relentless need to receive love, to give love, to move closer to the source of love. And it's that unfinished place in each of us that ultimately can either bring harm or healing. And that's to be determined.
And that's, I think you nailed it, what you said of everyone in the film is both a victim and a perpetrator, which are two things that we don't really want to be either one, right?
Right. Yeah. And so there's a lot of examples, but there is a beautiful man that is a locksmith, he's Hispanic, right? And he comes to a home of a rich white woman that's like the wife of a political figure, and he's just repairing the locks because her house, she's been assaulted. They were shot at. She's terrified, and she's scared for her life. She's scared of everything. She's lonely. She's isolated. She's scared. She has all the resources in the world, but she's the loneliest person in the film. Then there's this Mexican guy that's replacing the lock, and she's terrified of him because of the bias that she has. He has some tattoos. She assumes that they're gang tattoos. She assumes that this man is the man that shot through their home, which he has no correlation with them. And so you have this leaning to look at this Mexican man as less than, as a perpetrator. Next scene, you have him coming home, and he is pouring love into his daughter, who's scared because there was a drive-by shooting because they actually live in the poor part of town. And he offers the most winsome, strong, affectionate, bold care to his daughter, right?
Yeah.
And it's the most masculine scene in the film of just masculinity restored. And so you have this juxtaposition of this man that is both the victim of racial hate, and also there's a perpetrator because he lashes out at a customer that doesn't understand because of miscommunication in language. And then you have this heroism in him of a really great heart and a man who just wants to be a father and a husband and do honest work. And so all the layers of it move us beyond bias and allow us to see people perhaps as God might see them.
Well, and now I'd like to, because you brought up bias now, and what you pointed out about Daniel Ruiz, his played by Michael Pena. But his character, interestingly, as you were talking, is he kind of towed the line where he was never a victim, but he also wasn't a perpetrator. He dealt on it. He found that balance in that, even though he was sort of the victim of the prejudice and the fear from Sandra Bullock's character, Jean, who was, wanted the locks changed after he did it because she was scared that he was going to sell them to some gangbanger buddies. But he never retaliated. He never responded. He never owned that perpetration against him. He never became a victim, even though I think in a lot of ways they tried to make him one in the story.
Yeah, that's well said, Paul. I think it gets to this idea of he never took it on as an identity. So in the film, there are people that are victimized, but the question is, will they take on the identity of victim?
Yeah.
Because see, in the kingdom of God, no one is a victim and no one's a perpetrator. In the restored reality of our identity, rooted in our design. You think about that. We always have a choice of whether or not we will be a victim. And it's actually this brilliant on-ramp to the dignity of being little kings and little queens, as Jesus sets it up in his kingdom, right? That no matter what kind of harm comes against you, we have the dignity to say, I will not choose to be a victim. And no matter what kind of assault comes against us, we can choose to respond in love. Right? Dallas says that we can actually become the kind of person that our natural reaction, without thinking about it, is to love our enemies and bless those who curse us. And so you're right, that character, more than any other in the film, maintains the high road. I would say lives out of place of more wholeheartedness and more maturity, that though he is terribly treated and is victimized and is judged, he doesn't retaliate. He knows who he is as a father, as a husband, as a man, and he lives out of that identity with integrity. And it feels like a real mirror back to each of us of what we do with our identity and the conclusions that we come to from assaults that come our way.
If you haven't watched the movie by now, when you do watch it, you should look at it from that point of view as well, of seeing how is this character a victim? How are they also a perpetrator? And then watch how Daniel walks through that minefield without blowing anything up. Would be a really interesting way to look at the different characters in the movie.
Yeah, that's well said.
So now I do want to transition to talk about bias, because that really is sort of the impetus for your selection of this movie, specifically looking at bias. And you had a kind of a time of sharing about a month or so ago where you discussed our inner biases and how naturally they came to us, and you coordinated, or you pulled in Jesus' talk about the plank in our eye. We need to remove our own plank so that we that can then help with the speck in other people's eyes. And so I want to dive into that, because putting it in that perspective, especially in this current culture where there is so much division and so much criticism and judgment, I think it's very easy, because I know I get that feeling of when I look at somebody else's decision and say, I can't see how they would say that or how they would do that. And then again, going back to the plank in my eye, I can't see because I have the plank. And so I want to just sort of pitch it, softball it to you and say, and set you up to talk about that concept of bias, especially how it's seen in this movie.
Yeah, I do think you're illustrating something really important for our time in history, that this idea of division and hatred and separation is really a cultural, it's in the atmosphere of our culture. And so the question is, what is Jesus's redemptive work? What is his answer to the dilemma that we face? Every generation has unprecedented challenges and unprecedented provisions. And so I do think in this hour, this film is really worth resurrecting because it really daylights the idea of bias. And I think what I'd say, Paul, is bias fundamentally is a leaning in favor or against a person or thing compared to another. So it's a leaning in favor or against a person or thing compared to another. And we can have bias that are healthy, that are ordained, that are by design, that are really fruitful. And we can also have bias that are very destructive, that are very limiting, that are punitive. And so bias in and of itself is neutral. It's not unlike money. Like scriptures talk about money more than most any other thing. And the scriptures say the love of money is the root of evil. Not that money's the root of evil. And money in and of itself is a means of exchange. It's neutral. It's morally neutral. But the motives attached to it and how we handle it, how we steward it, surface, leanings towards or away from God. And so, I've been really chewing on this concept for months, and I did an inventory, and I just noticed, I tried to do an inventory of some of the bias that's in me, that's in my mind, that's in my body, that's in my story. Now, in these things, I'm not trying to put value on it. I'm just saying these objectively. I'm a man, okay? Like, I'm not a woman. I'm a man, and I will be a man. Okay? And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but what's so important is everything I do, I experience as a man.
Yeah.
But we have a dog in our house, and that's new to us. And the men and the women of our house handle that dog differently. Some of that is temperament. Some of that is story. But some of that is gender. Okay? Let me give you some other ones. I'm white. I was born to two immigrant families, Irish Catholic and Polish Jew. And my dad and I wanted to learn how to play golf. And so at 11, I took golf lessons, and we tried to join a country club because my dad grew up poor and then he became a doctor. And in Pittsburgh, if you golf and you're a doctor, you join a country club. Well, we were blackballed from the country club because he was a Jew and we weren't allowed to join. And so that's just a fact in my story. Another fact is I was arrested twice at age 8, age 16. Stories for another day. What's interesting about that, okay, that's a whole nother podcast. There were virtually no consequences to my being arrested twice. And it's funny, for other people that may not be a big deal, but for me, that formed an extraordinary bias in my story. Okay, I was mugged by two black men at gunpoint outside a movie theater when I was in high school. I was extremely overweight as a young boy. I'm American. I was born in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, and my soul as a man was saved through wild places in the West. And so all those bullet points are simply objective realities of things that happened in my story that, for better and or for worse, shape the person I've become today, and my bias, my leaning in favor or against a person or thing. I mean, when I see a cop, my gut reaction without thinking is to run. Okay? Like literally in my body, if I see a cop, it's run, because my whole childhood, it was running from the cops.
Yeah.
And also there's a thing of respect for police, because I grew up in a culture where you did respect police. And I did a ride along in Aurora in downtown Denver one time. And I'll just never forget, in an 11-hour shift, profound disrespect almost everybody had for the cops that we encountered. And I was just blown away because I didn't grow up in a culture of disrespect for police officers. So here's what's important. Again, we have to be really careful. We're talking about race. We're talking about gender. These are all hot buttons.
Yeah.
That's not what's important. What's important is the fact that you and I walk into a situation and we do not see that thing the same. It is very different. So what's important is I need to say, I do not see clearly. I see what I want to see. I see what I choose to see. Or another way of saying it is I believe, therefore I see. And so that's where it ties into this brilliant parable of Jesus, where he talks about the plank and the speck. And probably most of you are familiar with it. But in it, he's trying to teach people how to relate to others in love, right? The whole mission is to love people for their sake. And he says, and so this is in relationship to a marriage, it's in relationship to a friendship, it's in relationship to a child, anybody entrusted to our care. And he says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? He says, you hypocrite, you must first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And so the kind of the summary, because we don't have time to unpack it all today, but fundamentally the invitation is this: as a person who's wanting to mature, to become wholehearted, to become the kind of person that loves well and sees clearly, we have to know that we have a speck and others have a plank. In other words, to really learn how to love well in a relationship is to keep our side of the street clean. It's to deal with what our issue is and to treat it as 100 to 1, the issue in relationship with other people. That my concern is the plank in my eye, that the ratio is it's far more of an issue than the speck in another person's eye, and that we have to do the work to remove that in order that we can see clearly. And the assumption here is we don't see clearly, okay? Because I was blackballed at a country club, I have a disdain for country clubs. Right. And because I grew up in a rather kind of affluent white suburban world because my dad grew up poor and he made money as a doctor. But because I lacked initiation and I lacked some man shepherding my soul, I have kind of a resentment towards what I call the rich white corridor. I actually enjoy a blue collar culture more than a white collar culture. And if left to my own choices, I will lean towards, I will have bias towards things that people would say, things and people and places and activities that people would say are more blue collar than white collar. And that's not temperament. That's not gifting. That is bias within my story that I have to be aware of. And finally, the idea with this, Paul, in the parable and frankly in the film, is when we deal with our plank, we can begin to see clearly in order that we can help our brother with the speck in his eye. And so the redemptive power in this film is in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, people become more aware of their plank. They become more aware of how their pain with their bias has caused them to either become victims or perpetrators. And through process that we would say God intervening through discipleship and restoration, deliverance, they become the kind of people that over time walk a mile in another person's shoes. Over time, they bless and don't curse. And over time, they see clearly and begin to help their brothers and sisters with the speck in their eye. And that really is the ultimate form of love in relationship.
That's a lot. That's a lot of heavy stuff that we talk about, we get in depth and stuff, but to me, this is important because, like I mentioned, the Matt Dillon's character earlier, you see that shift where the woman is in the car and she's hanging upside down by the seatbelt and he's crawling under as there's a fire, there's gas leaking, there's pressure. He wants to help her. He's running to the fire, right? He's both a hero, and like we said, victim and perpetrator. He's a hero and he's a criminal at the same time. And he's crawling under there, and you see one of the most powerful scenes as he's trying to save her. He wants to save her. He actually gets pulled out and jumps back in order, risking his life to save hers. But he sees the impact. He sees the damage that he's done. And as she walks away, as she's taken away, I think, as I'm watching, I'm like, he's wrestling with who he has become.
Yes.
And there's a clip I'm going to play where his partner, who is tired of watching him be a jerk and to mistreat people and use his powerful to hurt other people, he says, I can't be your partner anymore. And there's a whole other storyline that we're not going to dig into about that, about how to handle conflict and confrontation and stuff. But he stops by the car. He's waiting by the car. And he says, I wanted to wish you luck. But then he says a couple other things.
Maybe they didn't tell you, but I've been reassigned.
Yeah, they told me. I just wanted to say good luck, and it was good riding with you.
You too.
Wait till you've been on the job a few more years.
Yeah.
Look at me. Look at me. Wait till you've been doing it a little longer. You think you know who you are? You have no idea.
And I love that that line of, you think you know who you are, but you don't know who, you don't know until you've walked a mile. And in that scene with the car where he rescues, and I can't remember her name, where he rescues Thandie Newton's character, he sees who he has become and he doesn't like it.
Yes. Yeah, it's really complex, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, it's complex. These are layered characters, a layered scene, but to simplify it, who have I become and who am I becoming?
Yeah.
Right? Those are the questions of masculine identity and masculine initiation. And so, yeah, you have this cop, just again, to orient people. He's the one with a sick dad, super frustrated, law enforcement. He's cynical because it's so ineffective. And at home, he feels powerless to help his dad. He feels like a victim with the insurance company. And then he has a young buck that's riding with him. This cop, the officer, Ryan, he molests the rich black woman, and the younger cop can't stand for it because he's holding to his ideals, and out of righteousness, he says, I'm not going to be with this guy, right? And so he gets reassigned. But you have the other cop, and that's that beautiful scene, right? That, yeah, you just played, like, you have no idea. You have no, and in some ways, Paul, when I hear that, it's almost like he says, you have no idea what you're capable of, like the evil that you're capable of, and you have no idea how brutal the world is. And it just seems like it's like an older man speaking to a son saying, yeah, you just don't know until you have the miles. And yet the irony of that scene, so that scene happens before he's reunited with the woman he victimizes, where she's in a car crash. The car's about to explode with gasoline. She is strapped upside down with a seatbelt. She's terrified of him because she's been victimized of him once. But he digs into the truest part of who he is as a man. The truth is he's a warrior. The truth is he has a golden heart, and he went into the force for the reason of helping people. And he offers her compassion. He offers her presence. He offers her intimacy in this car that's almost ready to catch on fire. And he offers her dignity. He treats her as a person and not an object. He gives her the invitation. Will you allow me to help you? I need to reach over your lap. She actually consents to it. The car turns on, lights on fire because there's a drip of fuel from another burning car. Some other police grab him and yank him out, and he scrambles away from those men, putting his own life at risk, grabs the woman, and as they pull him out a second time, he pulls her out. And the whole idea is it is this wrestling with who have I become and who am I becoming? And the deepest thing that's accessed in this film is that everyone bears the image of God in their deepest place, that everyone faces a great struggle. You know, I think it was Francis Schaeffer that said, be kind, for everyone you meet faces an enormous struggle. And that's what we see in that film, and that's what we see in that scene. It's a beautiful scene.
And it's interesting, as you mentioned, I even think back to my own dad. And I grew up in a conservative church, Christian home. And so I grew up, it's in the South. And so spanking was a part of our discipline. And my dad says there was a day where I wasn't in trouble or anything, but he said he was raising his hand. He was doing something and I flinched at his hand, because that is how they used to punish. They used to spank me with the hand. And he said at that moment, I was like, I will never spank you with my hand again. They used wooden spoons or a belt maybe, but because it's sort of a similar situation where he sees the result of his actions and he doesn't like where he's woken up. Many men wake up that way. They wake up and say, how have I gotten here? I never thought I'd wake up in this place, in this bed, in this situation. How have I gotten here?
And so let me ask you this, Paul. It's true. Every one of us is in process. Mm-hmm. I think that's when you really dive into the scriptures as a student, you see that the heroic heroes of the faith were mixed characters. They had checkered lives. They are more like us than we are led to believe. Right?
Yeah.
And my question to you, Paul, is like, so what is this film, Daylight, as an on-ramp to get our integrity back? What do we see in this film that's a window that says these characters are more of a mirror than we think? And that's why we have such an emotional reaction to them. What do you see in the film that says, and this is how we can recover wholeheartedness?
Well, and I think that's why it's difficult. It's challenging to watch because we do feel very close to these characters who display both victim and perpetrator, and we don't want to be either one of them. But one of the most, and they're all interesting characters, but Ludacris plays this very interesting character where he's going around and he plays an angry black man. He's angry at the lack of service in the restaurant. And he's like, well, they're not doing it because they think I won't tip because I'm black. And the kid asks, his friend says, well, how much did you tip? He's like, I didn't tip anything. I don't pay for that sort of service. And he's consistently angry at sort of the situation that he finds himself in, that he is unconsciously, subconsciously actually working towards. He criticizes the white couple for seeing them in the neighborhood and getting scared as they're about to carjack them. And
yes, and it's beautifully ironic, isn't it? It's beautifully ironic.
And he's such an interesting, and then he carjacks another car, but it's the husband of the wife who had been molested, and she had spent, after that situation with the cop, had really emasculated him of saying, you just laid down, you let this happen. And that wasn't his heart for her, but he's in his car and he's a black man, and Ludacris and his friend comes up and they carjack him, and he sort of snaps. He's like, no, you're not. There's a gun in his face, and no, you're not taking this. He's done being emasculated. He's done laying down. And this whole scene where he actually rescues Ludacris' character from the police because of his actions. But the scene where he drives and drops him off and he looks at him and he says, you embarrass me. You embarrass yourself. Your actions are contributing to the continued prejudice, the continued stereotyping. And what does he do? He just goes home. He sees the car, another van that he could steal. So he takes it in and they discover all these slaves in the back of the van. And the guy that he's trying to sell it to, he's like, I don't even care about the van. I'll pay you $500 for every person that's in there. And he has a moment. And we all have these moments. And he says, I'm going to do something I can be proud of. And he doesn't sell the van. He takes the van off, takes them down to Chinatown in LA there, and he sets them free to whatever life. It's a better life than the one they were chained to the wall of a van. But he didn't take the money. He made that 1 degree shift. We're always talking about these 1 degree shifts towards, that's not, as we mentioned, who are you and who are you becoming? He says, that's not who I want. I don't want to be somebody who's just doing this for the money, who can get a big payday. I need to do the right thing, even though it's going to cost me. I need to do something I can be proud of. And that's one of those redemptive moments that I saw in the movie of the moments of hope. As you mentioned, the daylight that comes in and is like, oh, there's hope for this guy. Because he made a decision to do something that he can be proud of.
Yeah, I love that moment in the film. And Paul, I think you're illuminating just this core experience of the human story of redemption, that there's a way to be good again.
Yeah.
And there's a way to get your integrity back. And that's a line from Kite Runner, a brilliant novel. But he says there's a way to be good again. And the brokenness or the sin, which results in shame and fear, doesn't have to have the final say. And when we come to realize that God is actually at work, orchestrating a path of redemption for every one of us with an on-ramp that's ever present, it's profoundly free. That at every moment of every day, there's a way to turn back and recover what God meant when he meant us. And so, like you said, with Ludacris, like at the beginning of the movie, you think he's the one guy that's not going to change, right? He is just victim, victim, victim.
Right.
And then he's perpetuating it, right? He's talking about the white people afraid of him, and then he carjacks them. But he is called out, and he has a choice. He can make a killing off of these slaves, or he can set them free at his own personal cost and risk of his own personal safety. And he chooses the high road. And that's when we encounter God. There's something of that choice that's modeled again and again in the film of choose for this day,
yes,
whom you will serve, right? And what I love about it is the intimacy of God meeting him right where he's at in the context of his story. And so I believe the Holy Spirit is always giving an on-ramp. The Holy Spirit knows who we are and who we are to become and what we're capable of in partnership with God. And so when we have an ear to hear and an eye to see what that on-ramp is, it's often in the smallest choices, the simplest gestures to say, I choose God. I choose integrity. I choose to receive that which I cannot manufacture on my own. This is not my indictment. The person I am today is not the end of the story. There's more available, and God is the primary source and energy for my becoming. But it's always my choice. That's the dignity of choice. And he had a choice. And there are different characters in the film that don't make that choice. They end up just mulling deeper resentment, deeper anger, deeper harm towards themselves and other people. And so, yeah, Paul, I appreciate you pointing that out. And I think that's a brilliant scene.
There's another scene towards the end that I wanted to talk about as we sort of close this up. The scene, and it's a character we haven't even really talked about. Detective Waters, played by Don Cheadle, and again, one of the major players of this. And as the movie goes, you see him trying to navigate these waters. He's seeing both sides of it, and he's trying to He's trying to navigate the system that's trying to manipulate him. He's like, well, he's offered a promotion. He's offered clearing his brother, who's been in jail 3 times because he's Ludacris's partner on the car thefts. And but as you watch the movie, this is a kid that you really like. He doesn't seem to be. He's calling out Ludacris's kind of his hypocrisy. He's like, how can you say that? How can you do that? You're saying one thing and doing the same thing you're condemning other people for. And he ends up getting shot and he ends up dying, and his mother shows up, their mother. And through the movie, we've seen that she's got a drug problem. And he has been helping her. She's asked him, go find your brother. And he hasn't, because he's been busy doing work. He's been working. But then he discovers his brother's body. And then his mother comes in and he says, Mom, I'm going to do whatever it takes to find the people that did this. And her response really is just chilling.
Oh, baby. Oh, baby.
Mom. I promise you. I promise. I'm gonna find out who did this, Mom.
Oh, I already know. You did. I asked you to find your brother, but you were busy. We weren't much good to you anymore, were we? You got things to do. You go ahead. I'll sign the papers.
Mom, I want to stay with you.
I just want to wait with my baby.
And she tells him, you did this. And this is a man that you've seen. He stopped by, refilled her fridge while she was unconscious. But she gave the credit towards his younger brother, the brother he was supposed to look out for. He wasn't seen by his mother. He was blamed by his mother. And sort of to go back and to pull in the bias, to pull in that idea of victim, and to pull into the idea of identity. She couldn't take ownership for her role in what happened, because her history, her background, her biases led to that event, but she couldn't handle it. She couldn't grasp it. And so, because I think for many of us, it's falsely empowering when we are the victim to shift the blame, to say, you did this, it's your fault. But you don't go through any transformation. You don't see the freedom. You don't see the fruit. You don't see what Ludacris sees and has a moment to be proud of. As you mentioned, we have to choose this day, and she didn't choose. She chose to blame the person who was most helpful to her.
Yes. Yeah, as you said, Paul, it's a chilling scene, and it's a complex scene. So if our listeners are going, what is going on? Like, you have to see the film to appreciate it, but to just pull it back into the big ideas that blame is most often a projection of pain. And so anywhere we see blaming, it's a projection of pain. It's unresolved pain, emotional distress that's looking for an outlet. And that's why when you see someone like Saint Stephen, who is a completely restored man because of the power of Christ, who is being persecuted, stoned to death, and he says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's the opposite of blame, where he's blessing because he's actually not in pain. Now, physically, he's getting destroyed, but soulfully, all is well because he's in the kingdom of God. And so in that scene, you're right, all of it reveals the plank in each person's eye. And the woman is a drug addict, the mother, but she's not taking ownership over her addiction. She's staying as a victim of poor Black woman. Her son is also has a long history of arrest, and he's a burglar and a thief. And again, these are identity statements. That's not his true heart, but he is turned towards crime for survival. And then the other son has made it as a black man in a predominantly white world. So he's become successful and admirable, and yet everyone's misunderstood.
Yeah.
What the successful black man can't see is that he has actually fallen into other stereotypes, that he's given himself permission to just have reverse bigotry and towards other people, and a judgmental spirit, and putting people in labels and being less than because he's risen up. But at the same time, here he is loving his mother and getting no credit. And so on and on it goes, that every person has a plank in their eye. And when they refuse to see it as a plank and other people's stuff as a speck, then inevitably, even if we consider it, we see ourselves with a speck, and we see a plank in another person's eye, and it never frees us to do the work of transformation and becoming wholehearted. And so ultimately, like this scene and many in the film, it's just an invitation to say, who have I become? What is that plank in my eye? Where do I not see clearly? And then another piece, Paul, that I love in the film and I love in our lives is bias is not all bad.
Right.
We have a bias that actually can be God intended for the unique role that we have in the earth. I am a protector. And when I walk into a concert or an environment that's social, a stadium, my wife is an encourager, and she thinks, how do I love each and every one of these people and pour on delight and laughter and empathize with people and make them feel like they're the most important person in the world, because they are. I walk in thinking, where is the threat? If something goes down, what are the exits? How do I care for the most vulnerable people in this place if everything goes to shit? Okay. Yeah. We both have our bias, and neither one is bad if we give it over in the service of love, if we allow Jesus to transform it and put it in his service of the kingdom, that both are needed. We need a cheerleader and we need a security guard, and together we make that happen, and we're a better team with each other than we are apart. And that's what this film brings to us.
I love that. We are better together than apart, because we each, as Paul says, we're the body of Christ. Some are hands, some are eyes, some are feet, some are all the parts.
Totally. In different parts, in different roles at different times, right? And that's all the nuances. We're not two-dimensional creatures. In many ways, we're four-dimensional. And the fourth is this God dimension that none of us fully understand. But the whole goal is to have a God-shaped life. Yeah. And so, for our listeners that are tuning in, I really encourage you to do the work with this film, to watch it and to ask questions. And, there's an activity, actually, and you could put it in your show notes, if there's some way for people to get it. But I actually had my assistant create a form that has every main character in this film, and to do an inventory of what is their bias and how was it formed and what was its impact and how did it change over time and what do I learn about myself from my experience of this person. And so it's a really powerful exercise to allow the film to be a mirror and ultimately lead us into healthier relationships with ourselves, with God, and with other people. And I think based on when this podcast airs, my BGS podcast won't yet be released, but late in November of 2021, there will be an extended podcast called What's Your Bias, where we go even deeper into these themes.
And so if you guys are listening to it, if you don't subscribe to the BGS podcast, the Become Good Soil podcast, you absolutely should. And if you're interested in this idea about bias, definitely dive in. Just like the movie, it's redemptively
disruptive.
It's definitely redemptively disruptive. So Morgan, thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing these thoughts. And man, it was a powerful movie. I loved it when I saw it. And it'll make you think, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's an honor to be with you, Paul, and with our listeners. And this is the deep work. And so I just commend anybody in this hour on the earth that's willing to slow down and think about how they think, to consider how they see, and to have the act of humility to consider that maybe the way we see isn't yet perfectly the way God sees. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of love. And our listeners out there, we think you're listening to this because we believe that God believes in you, and this is a path worth taking, and you can do it with him.
And like Ludacris's character, when you do that, when you spend that deep work, you can walk away with it with that sense of, you can feel proud about it. You can feel good about it and say, oh yeah, this is the direction I want to take my life. So thank you once again, Morgan. You guys, if you're listening, go check out the Become Good Soil podcast and their website, becomegoodsoil.com. It's been a transformative portion of my life over the last 8 years. So I can't recommend it highly enough. So this has been Paul McDonald and Morgan Snyder talking about Crash, the movie from 2004. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?